Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Korea Society. My name is Daniel Levine. I have the great pleasure of introducing this evening's speaker, Dr. Joan Kee. We'll discuss post-war Korean art. Dr. Kee received her BA in the history of art from Yale, and then she went to Harvard for a degree in law. But no one should hold that against her. She went on to get her PhD from NYU's Institute of Fine Arts. Dr. Kee's first book, Contemporary Korean Art, Tansaekhwa and the Urgency of Method, was published in 2013. And as I understand from a professor who's in our audience, it's already required reading in some classes. So, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Joan Kee. Here's your clicker.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Daniel, first for the generous introduction, but most of all to you, the audience, for taking the time to come out here on a now sort of spring-like March evening, which is quite different from what it was last week, so I was told. So tonight's talk is really, it's not a scripted talk. What I want to do, because there's actually been such little sort of historical information about this time period. So unlike, say, colleagues in, say, Chinese, Japanese, or Indian art, the study of Korean art, modern Korean art hasn't really been consolidated as a field until quite recently. In fact, it was only very recently that a Department of Art History in Korea has had a specialist in this field, which would be sort of shocking in the American instance if you could imagine, say, a university not having a specialist of American art. It's only been very recently that post-war Korean art has gained a certain foothold in an institution. The second thing you might notice about, just from the slide here and the title, is this use of the word post-war. So when we think about, say, mainstream histories of modern art that are taught, say, here in the United States, post-war almost always refers to post-World War II, 1945. But in Korea, the situation was quite different, that 1953 really becomes the benchmark. So 1953 is the year that marks the provisional end of the Korean War. And I say provisional because Korea still technically is in a state of war. And you also see the end date, 1979. Now, 1979, the reason for that is that that is the year that Park Chung-hee is assassinated. So the president of South Korea from 1961 to 1979, his death effectively marks a major paradigm shift in not only in the way that artists look at art, but in the way that culture is formed generally. Now, the first slide or image I'd like to introduce is a self-portrait. It's by a man named Lee Kwede. And Lee Kwede was one of the artists that was very active during the Japanese occupation of Korea. So you notice that the painting was painted in 1948. Now that's 3 years after World War II, so 3 years after the Japanese vacate Korea. And you'll also notice a couple of things that may kind of strike you as odd about the painting. So one is he's kind of standing frontally, but you also notice that his jacket is kind of sort of moving in the air, almost as if he's painting himself outside. But then on the other, you notice that the backdrop, it almost seems like a stage set. And so one of the issues that we see already in this painting alone is these certain kinds of tensions between what is my position, where am I situated, not only here within the painting itself, but within the world. You notice also in the background that you have figures on the left. So you have figures on the left right here. And they seem kind of sort of simplified in a way. So they're very sort of geometric. Their heads are rounded. That's actually coming from what Lee Kwede is what he's seeing in terms of Mexican art. And this is actually an aspect of Korean art that doesn't necessarily get emphasized. When one thinks about the international art world in Korean art, it's usually between Korea and the so-called West, or Korea and Japan. But there's also a Latin American aspect to this as well. So that's also something that hasn't been talked about, but one can envision that as a future stream of research. But again, I'm putting this particular work up here because, again, it really gets at this issue of not being very ambivalent about one's place in life. So it's 1948. It's 3 years after Korea's liberation from Japan. Korea itself, it's just in just utter chaos. And Lee Kwede is actually one of a large number of Korean artists and intellectuals who voluntarily migrate to the north. He's a Marxist by training. And what he sees happening in the South, this is not something that he wants to be part of. So like many of his colleagues, he goes to the north. Now, he, of course, gets purged during one of North Korea's many purges of intellectuals. But at this point, this is one of the idea of placelessness is one of the concerns. Now, a work that was made in 1949, so it's almost contemporaneous. It's an ink and color on paper painting. So a lot of artists who were trained during the Japanese occupation were trained in a genre of painting called Nihonga, which literally means Japanese painting. And it's a genre of painting that really combines many different ways of depiction. So it's not quote unquote Western per se. It's not quote unquote traditional ink painting. It's really a genre of painting that's meant to combine many different aspects from many parts of the world. Chang Woo-sung is one of those painters who's trained in this way of looking. But what you see here is a portrait of the Virgin Mary and Jesus, but redone in a Korean context. Now, this also, again, I'm putting this up here to address another issue which hasn't been touched upon so much, and that is the role of religion. Because many painters, especially in South Korea, say in the 1940s and 50s, were Christians, and they were very ardent Christians at that. So how is it that one can make this very familiar configuration of the Virgin Mary and Jesus seem more familiar to a Korean audience? How does one, say, think about accessibility in a way that also relates back to what has been kind of received before? Now, one thing that you'll notice was the previous painting was that it was an ink painting. And this also is another ink painting. But this takes ink painting in a completely different direction. This is a work by Park Nae-hyun, and she's one of Korea's very few prominent female artists. So like, as with nearly every history of art, women painters are few and far between. Korea is up, it's obviously no exception. But Park Nae-hyun was, again, one of the few artists that was able to, in many ways, transcend a very systematic form of discrimination against women in Korea at this time, especially if you're a professional woman. But the reason why I'm bringing her work up here is also because one thing to think about was that ink painting was, for many, many years, the predominant medium in Korea. It wasn't Western-style oil painting. Sculpture was considered almost akin to menial labor. So in terms of the hierarchy of different media, so what was the most prestigious? It was ink painting. And so for that reason, a lot of the works that you'll see in the late 40s and 50s tended to be ink. But with Park Nae-hyun's work, it's not what you would call strictly figurative. So you notice that it says owl, but the owl's face, it's kind of compressed. What you start to get is an idea of painting that isn't based on quote unquote realistic depiction, but really based on how do you piece different parts of a painting together. So for example, you have areas of color that are almost fitted as if it was a puzzle. So one thing that you'll notice about Park Nae-hyun's work is that it moves increasingly towards abstraction, which is a word that doesn't really get used in Korea until later in this decade. But when one thinks about abstraction, one often, unconsciously or not, tends to associate it with Western-style oil painting. But in fact, it was the ink painters who were in many ways taking up this abstraction torch earlier than their oil painting counterparts. Now, another artist, another ink painter who's thinking about, say, how is it that one can rethink what it means to be an ink painter at this time? So again, you'll notice that it's 1958. This is 5 years after the provisional end of the Korean War. This is a time that's really an upheaval because so many of members of the Korean art world had fled to the north. So we're not only talking about a country that was just physically decimated, we're also talking about an art world that really had no bearings because many of the major critics, the artists, the dealers, organizers of exhibitions, they had all gone to the north. Now, some artists like Kwon Young-woo, so Kwon Young-woo at this time, he's around, say, 35 years old, he's thinking about this space as an opportunity to experiment with different ways of depiction. So the work you see here, it's called Fantasy on the Seashore, and it's of a seashell that he had collected while on one of his various fishing expeditions. But the seashell it's greatly enlarged. You don't really necessarily see a seashell this, say, large as to almost take up the entirety of a 1.2 meter painting. And then you see this odd ship in the background. So one aspect about this painting is that it really throws off the scale. It's, again, not a painting that you can see and immediately identify where it is that you are in relation to this object. You notice also that the object does have some kind of illusionistic space. In other words, there is some kind of volume in terms of the shading of the interior of the shell. But then he almost kind of repudiates that by using that black line. You see that black line is pretty much just outlining all the parts of that shell, the little anchor, and that little ship. Now that interest in the black line, this is something that every ink painter that was trained in this time, that's what they were trained to think painting was. That painting is a function of the line and the point. How is it that one can construct, say, objects from these two relatively sort of fundamental units? Now, just to take things in a slightly different direction, when we think about, say, ink painting and sort of the pursuit of ways in which to rethink media, is the question of medium is something that has a lot of weight in Korea. The reason for that being is that the entire artistic infrastructure in Korea during the Japanese occupation, everyone was separated into, you were either an ink painter, you were either an oil painter, you were either a sculptor, you were a photographer, there's not a lot of cross-pollination between those particular categories. So one aspect that's a little unorthodox in this context is to bring in photography, which until the early 60s was not included in, say, the government's official definition of fine art. And what I mean by that is that the government had an annual juried salon, the National Art Salon, the Gukjeon, where pretty much everyone anyone tried to enter and get their work selected. Photography was very explicitly excluded from that until recently, until the 1960s. But here I'm bringing up this particular photograph, again, because many of these photographers are actually very close friends with painters, with sculptors. This is a very small art world, relatively speaking. And to give you some idea of its scale, in 1963, there were 4 commercial galleries in Seoul. In Japan, there were 27. So it gives you some idea of the smallness of this art world, which also meant that these artists were interacting with one another. They often commented on each other's work. And Lee Hae-sun is no exception. Lee Hae-sun, by the way, is the grandson of Heungsun Daewon-gun. And I bring that up because the dimension of class is also just another factor to consider in a lot of these earlier post-war works. To have a camera at this time, in the 1950s, you had to have access and you had to have a great deal of money. So lots of artists would talk about how having a camera was as expensive as having a house. And Lee Hae-sun, he's of the royal family. He has the access. Money, not so much. He actually obtained his camera from one of the American GIs who was stationed in Seoul at this time. But bringing up this photograph here is, again, have this idea of this real sort of division in terms of the different worlds that are starting to form in, say, the 1950s. So Korea under a great deal of reconstruction. You have, say, the thermoelectric power plant in the sort of the upper half, and then you have women going about their washing at the bottom. And then you have this chain link fence kind of separating the two. So a lot of photographs that you'll see at this particular time really get at this idea of a world that isn't really integrated. That's a world that's very much fragmented, yet people are coexisting in sort of the same space. Another photograph, contemporaneous photograph, is one by Kim Han-young. Kim Han-young is the first photographer to specialize in commercial advertising. Now, one thing that makes that interesting here is that you start to think, well, what is he actually trying to sell? So what is the sort of image that he's trying to convey here? And again, note that all of these photographs, they're not meant to be seen as fine art. These photographs are almost generally, not always, but generally published in newspapers. So a lot of these photographers are making their living as photojournalists. Occasionally, you'll have, say, photographs sold as postcards. But again, these are works that are really meant to be seen by a much more general public than tends to be the case with some of the ink paintings that we've seen. But again, in terms of thinking about that idea of this fragmented world, you have these skiers tying their laces, and then you have another set of skiers wearing the traditional the kat, the horsehair hat, and their white hanbok, just staring at them as if to say, what are you people doing? So again, there's another layer of interest with these photographs is who has the agency? So in other words, who's doing the looking or who's being looked at? This is a theme that you'll see just come up over and over again with these photographs. And part of that reason also has to do with how the state, the government at this time, is using photographs as its own way of extending its surveillance over private citizens. Now, once we get into, say, the 1960s, and photographs like these are now becoming more and more accepted as quote-unquote fine art, the National Art Salon that I'd mentioned previously, so that annual juried salon that the government puts up every year that people try to have their works, for which people try to have their works chosen, you see an inordinate number of images like this. So images of rebuilding. Someone like Kim Do-sun just decides, you know what, I'm just going to make it easier for everyone. I'm going to call it reconstruction. So there's going to be no doubt about the subject. But what's interesting about, say, a work like this is that, again, it's not really quite clear whether reconstruction, that positive image that the state wants to kind of channel, is really there. So you have these two guys, bricklayers, at the top, and then you have this sort of long sort of chute where they're putting one brick, letting one brick slide down. It's not clear if they're rebuilding the building or if they're taking it down. And so another kind of sub-theme with a lot of these photographs is the ambiguity of the subject. What is it that they're actually trying to represent? Is it really about following a certain kind of party line, or is it about, say, trying to circumvent that party line to show a different kind of way through which to think about what it means to live in the state that is all about reconstruction? Now, just to give some background context about this just relentless drive for reconstruction. So what you see on the left is a map of the two Koreas, Seoul in the red box, and then on the right, what you see is Sejongno, so the downtown, the main thoroughfare above in 1966. That's no traffic, which is very, very unlike what it is now. You could actually walk around without coughing up black smoke. And you still see the Japanese colonial headquarters at sort of the base of Bugaksan, and then you see the old city hall. Now, down at the left, you see this giant statue of Lee Sun-shin. So Admiral Lee Sun-shin kind of, they often like to describe him as the Horatio Nelson of Korea, which I think is a huge disservice to both. But what's interesting about just even this little sliver of this photograph, these are photographs that are actually taken by state photographers taking pictures for Seoul Shinmun. So that's a government organ. But even in this small sliver down at the left, you already see there are more cars and this giant statue, which kind of seems out of place. It's very, very tall, and you see this sort of almost menacing figure. And if you look for those of you who have seen the statue in person, you'll also notice that he doesn't seem to really look straight ahead as to look down at the people kind of hovering at his base looking up. So one other thing to think about is that if, given that the statue was something that was personally commissioned by the president, by Park Chung-hee, what were sort of the intentions behind having this statue that seemingly represent all of Korean people and the long tradition of Korean military prowess, but at the same time seems so far removed from the individual? So another element to think about was just these two photographs is this question of scale. So what happens to the individual amidst all of this sort of epic reconstruction? Now, to, again, go back to the ink painting question, is we talked a little bit about the question of abstraction, that you have increasing numbers of artists who are kind of not so much giving up on the figure as really trying to think about a different way of parsing the space within, say, ink painting. And another example would be Lee Eun-no. So Lee Eun-no is someone who, some of you might think, that looks an awful lot like Pollock, which is true in certain respects. So Pollock is one of the first artists, or abstract expressionism in general was very heavily promoted by the US Embassy in Korea at this time. And so a lot of artists would see reproductions of their work in shows that were sponsored by the State Department. But to say that Lee Eun-no, say, took his cue from Pollock, I think is, again, kind of selling him a little short, mainly because this is not an all-over painting, for one. So by all over, a painting that's equally approached from all four sides. This seems like it could be an all-over painting, but you also notice the sign, his signature and the chop on the lower left-hand corner. This is a painting that has a very definite sense of orientation. The other aspect that you'll notice is, again, that use of line. So one of the concerns that Lee Eun-no had was, how is it that line alone could be used to generate a sense of space that wasn't necessarily, say, illusionistic, but it wasn't necessarily flat either? So how is it that one can preserve the tension between surface and depth? This is also another concern that a lot of these ink painters have, because they're all very conscious of working in ink. They know what it is that a brush can do. They know what, say, the range of properties that ink and the paper that they use have. So they're not really trying to be Western-style oil painters. In fact, a lot of them are very conscious of their greater prestige vis-a-vis their Western-style oil painting colleagues. Now, their Western-style oil painting colleagues had a thing or two to say of their own as well. And here's an installation view of what was called the Wall Exhibition, Pyeokjeon, in Seoul. It took place in 1960. And you'll notice straight away that thinking, why are the paintings hung on the wall? Now, the reason for that is that, again, we mentioned briefly about the National Art Salon. So the National Art Salon was held in the Palace building, and that palace was located inside the walls on which these paintings are installed. Now, the National Art Salon was very, very hostile to abstraction, especially oil painting, at least in the late 50s and the early 1960s. And so the members of, say, smaller groups that tended to be very invested in this kind of non-figuration, decided to have sort of a guerrilla art show, a pop-up art show of their own. And so what they did was they commandeered a sort of two of the walls around this palace and hung their paintings just out there for anyone to see. So another thing you also notice, say, the people coming by, you also notice that the road seems like it's almost kind of been uprooted. So again, that issue of, say, reconstruction, of rebuilding the city, that's always present in this unconscious of these artists. But for the artists who are participating in the wall exhibition, they're very much interested in how do we, say, make this accessible to a general public, but also how is it that the surface of the wall, so that's kind of this made of rough granite, and how does that surface resonate with the surfaces of these paintings? because even in this sort of not so great photograph, you can kind of see that it has a lot of texture. So the paint is really kind of worked over. It's really built up. These are paintings in many ways that are best seen from the side, so you can kind of see the protrusion rather than seen, say, face on. One of the artists that was very much associated with this kind of, say, non-figuration was Park So-bo. And you see Park So-bo himself in his studio on the left. And you can almost tell already how small that studio is. It just has paintings kind of stacked around. And he has a painting called Number One. So again, there is a certain connection with Pollock just by the title alone. And the actual painting is on the right. But you see already that the paintings are actually quite small. They're not necessarily these grand sort of canvases. And you also notice that he's painting by laying the canvas on the ground. Now, this technique of laying paintings on the ground, that actually comes from a larger engagement with ink painting. So something to just keep in mind is that until, say, in the mid-1960s, every artist who went to an art school in Korea was trained in both ink painting and both Western-style oil painting, and as well as printmaking, in some cases sculpture. So a lot of them were jacks of all trades. So I'm thinking about, say, how is it that he gets from, say, the image on the left to what he makes on the right? One wants to think of these works as inherently multimedia by nature. Now, the idea of abstraction as having some kind of ideological sort of resonance. This is, again, something that that's been very extensively written about when it comes to, say, American or Western European abstraction, but it also has a real urgency in the Korean context. And the image that you see here just kind of lays it out for you straight on. On the left is the 8th volume of Shinmisul. So it's one of the few actually it was really sort of the only continuously published art magazine at that time. And you see this is actually a cropped image of a larger print. And it's clearly not figurative. Now on the right, published about maybe 3 months before the volume on the left, is the cover of Joseon Misul. This is the official organ of the North Korean art world. And already you see, again, what their priorities are. So their priority, again, is having this sort of poster. It says peaceful unification. I'm not sure how swinging a giant I-beam into a crowd would be peaceful, but again, such as artistic license. But everything is spelled out. You know, it's even the title. It's like it's not just peaceful unification. It's like big block letters, and this was actually based on a poster that was meant to be seen from quite a distance. The original image on which this cover is based, it's about, say, 2 by 1 meters high. So it's a very sort of large image that's meant to be seen by a large number of people and by people without regard to differing levels of knowledge or education. Now, abstraction starts to take on a certain kind of, well, we have abstraction, what can you do in North Korea? Now, the North Korean art world, because it has that critical mass of some of the most prominent critics that worked during the Japanese occupation. So before 1945, they're saying, oh, if you're going to do abstraction, that means you're just copying the West. And so the two sides are really just looking at one another and just thinking, how is it that we can sort of outdo the other in particular realms? Now, North Korea is quite interesting in the sense that it's the only communist country in the world to actively encourage ink painting. This is a very different. This is very different from, say, their mainland Chinese colleagues. Mainland China, for many years, ink painting was given secondary status. It was considered elitist, bourgeois. Now, in North Korea, that wasn't the case. Ink painting was the true sort of spirit of the Korean people. This is the kind of rhetoric that was produced. And an ink painting like this, so this is a work by Seo Se-ok. Some of you may be familiar with his son's work. His son is a very prominent contemporary artist, Seo Do-ho. A work like Seo Se-ok's work would have been considered by the North Korean critics as decadent, as something that was just, what is this? Just couple of blobs on a surface that's coated with water. Now, with Seoul, for him, he's actually looking to his Western-style oil painting colleagues. The reason why I say Western-style oil painting, even though it's kind of a mouthful, is because there is oil painting within the ink painting tradition. So this is, I just say this just to, again, make that distinction clear. With Seoul, he's looking at people like palpable. So palpable becomes the sort of enfant terrible of the Korean art world, that becomes this bad boy figure, gets a lot of attention. The ink painters are thinking, wait, we're the ones that are supposed to be the nexus of the Korean art world, and here they are, they're finding themselves losing ground. They're not being considered contemporary anymore. They're being considered historical or traditional. So someone like Seoul is saying, we have to do something about this. And so what he ends up doing is really experimenting with the materials of ink. So this is hanji. So hanji is made from the fibers of the mulberry bark, and it's very strong. It's hard to rip. I tried it at home. It'll take you a long time. But Seoul would cover this paper with water, and it would actually hold the water. It's strong enough to hold the water. And he would then kind of use his brush to make marks on this water so that the ink would kind of spread around and travel, which is why you get this weird sort of organic motion. And this is a work that's really governed by chance. Now, he had colleagues, like his friend from college, so Kwon Young-woo. So Kwon Young-woo is someone we saw his seashell a while ago. Now, Kwon Young-woo, he says, you know what? I'm not even going to use ink or the brush. I'm just going to use paper. Both these works are made by first getting a plywood panel and then wrapping it with a brown wrapping paper. The kind that it's very ordinary, very cheap, the kind that you would use to wrap up a package. And then he would cut pieces of the hanji, so that traditional support that would ordinarily be used for ink painting directly onto this panel, or he would say rip little holes from the hanji to produce kind of almost a negative grid. So with Kwon Young-woo, his interest is how is it that negative space can actually be thought of as positive space? This is another image of Kwon Young-woo at work. And you notice that, again, he doesn't use a brush. He's just using his finger directly to kind of just poke at the canvas. What he will do is take a panel that's been covered with this hanji paper, and then he would just wet it in certain places and just kind of continuously, just repetitively, just rip at it until the darker wrapping paper would show through. Now, this is, and also just as a last note, one thing is that he's working on an easel. This is not something that ink painters do. Ink painters really just place their works on a flat horizontal support, but here he's using an easel. So again, this also indicates a certain kind of, say, freewheeling attitude towards these otherwise very, very strict ingrained distinctions of medium that were so endemic in the Korean art world at this time, and even now for that matter. Now, someone who is really trying to think about how is it that one can negotiate between, say, these two different media? How is it that one can, say, think about painting without necessarily being beholden to the obligations or the perceived obligations of being trained as an oil painter or being trained as an ink painter, is a man named Kim Hwang-gi. And Kim Hwang-gi, he's actually spent he actually died in New York. He lived in New York for many years. This is a work that he actually painted while in New York. Where and in what form shall we meet again? Again, you get a sense of a certain kind of nostalgia already from the title. And it was painted in 1970. Now, the way it was made is that he would take a brush of the kind that wasn't necessarily used for oil painting, but often the kind of brush that you'd use for calligraphy or ink painting. And he would dot the canvas. He would first divide the canvas into different sort of small spaces. So as you see here, every little dot is encased in this kind of square, right? And one thing that we briefly talked about before is this idea of ink painting being a function of points and lines. Now, that idea is also something that someone like Paul Klee, say in Euro-American art history, also had. But Paul Klee is not someone that Kim Hwang-gi is really thinking about. He's really thinking about this idea of, well, what is the place of ink painting? You know, I may be, say, trained as a Western style oil painter. He was one of the first painters to really take up abstraction, but there's also this kind of other sort of history to deal with as well. That sort of thinking also was inherited by his son-in-law, so Yoon Hyung-gun. And Yoon Hyung-gun also is someone he's an oil painter, but the works that you see here, the oil is made to behave as if it could be ink. So in both cases, what he's done is he's taken very raw canvas, very coarsely woven hemp, partially for cost reasons, because getting proper duck canvas was very, very expensive, but really because he liked the way that the pigment interacted with this sort of very coarse fabric. On the right, you see that it seems like it's a spectrum of browns. So you see that sort of a lighter sort of brown as your eye moves towards the center. That's because he's using a mixture of turpentine and pigment. And when you use turpentine and in as much quantity as Yoon Hyung-gun, it starts to separate. So in that idea of chance, of not necessarily controlling the outcome of how paint behaves, this is something that Yoon Hyung-gun is very interested in. Now, I've talked a lot about painting and photography, but that certainly was not what all post-war Korean artists were thinking. And one example just to bring up here is another female artist, a woman named Kim Young-ja. And in 1967, there was a very important show called the Young Artists Coalition Exhibition, 청년작가 연립전. And this is an exhibition that was important primarily because there was almost no painting. It was a lot of works that were either performance or what you might call, say, almost proto-installations. So Kim Young-ja she's trained in sculpture, but what she's decided to show for this exhibition is an enlarged matchbox of the kind that was common at this time. So you see there's a little, so they were called UN matches. And so what she's done is she's enlarged. So it's about 130 centimeters high. So it's about almost like 3.5 feet high. It's this kind of big sort of object in the middle of an exhibition. One might think about, say, pop art in relation to this, but it's interesting that pop art, unlike in Japan or pretty much Western Europe or the United States, it never takes hold in Korea, primarily because an artist like Kim Young-ja is thinking, you need an industrialized country for pop art to make sense. In 1967, Korea is not, it's not really quite there. It's still among the poorer countries of the world that industrialization doesn't have that kind of sort of critical density as it does, say, in Japan or, say, Western Europe, the US. So so Kim Young-ja is someone that is really not thinking about pop so much, but rather about what are sort of these everyday objects? What are sort of the objects that go unseen? And because of their being invisible, how does that actually have a greater effect on how people live their lives? So what would it mean to blow up this very common, cheap, sort of ordinary matchbox and place it in the middle of a gallery? Another artist that also participated in this show was Moon Bok-chol. Now, you notice that you have sort of these 4 round, sort of strange stone-like things at the top. So it's basically kind of your almost garden variety, not crudely painted black monochrome. What one would consider sort of the monochrome is sort of one of those paradigmatic ideas in abstraction. But then he's painted these weird sort of semi-globular shapes at the top. These are actually gourds. So these are gourds that he actually plucked from his own garden, cut them in half, and then just decided to use colors that for him were actually taken from temple architecture. So you have, say, the bright reds, for example, or say that sort of bright blue-green. So in some ways, how is it that he's deliberately kind of compromising the sort of the purity or sort of the claims to absoluteness that abstraction is often correlated with. another artist who also participates in that 1967 exhibition. So another female artist, Chung Kang-ja. And the work that she presents here, so you already notice her skirt. It gives you some idea of where her interests lie. They're made of blank dog tags. So she's having herself photographed wearing the skirt of blank dog tags in front of one of her sculptures. Unfortunately, it's only in black and white, but this is this crazy, just multicolored, just this object. Something that's very organic, something that takes its cues from, say, the curves of the body. And it's also, you notice a slight indentation. It was originally meant to be sat upon. So another sort of theme that's kind of recurring throughout a lot of these works is this question of access. How is it that these works can make sense to a viewer? How is it that they can relate to a viewer, not on this, you can easily read what you see, you can easily figure out its meaning, but rather, how does it sort of resonate with the viewer on a more visceral, on a more bodily level? Again, another artist who shows at this the 1967 show, but this is actually a later work that he does, is Lee Seung-taek. And Lee Seung-taek, like Chung Kang-ja, so sculpture is their chosen medium, but they've taken that medium in very different directions. So when one thinks about, say, how people were trained in sculpture, especially in 60s Korea, is that they're building those crazy, just commemorative bronze statues, like such as the one of Admiral Lee Sun-shin that we've seen previously, or they're helping their professors build these sort of large, cumbrous statues. They always have a base. It's always made of metal or stone, and it's always vertical. But here, what Lee Seung-taek has done is it's all just kind of on the ground. It's you notice, again, by the title and also by the materials, it's human hair. And this is human hair that's taken from the heads of draftees to the Korean army. So Lee Seung-taek's uncle is an officer in the Korean army, and he had access to the company barbershop. And he asked, can I go in and take the hair that, so the military draft, it's mandatory in Korea. And so one of the issues that Lee Seung-taek was interested in is how does one respond to this event that is so ubiquitous among, say, himself and every man that he knows? How is it that one can think about it almost as a memorial? So what he did was to take all of his hair, just bags of hair, just almost just these giant loads of hair. And what he does is he configures that hair in different formations. Now, this room that he's in, you might think to yourself, might be rather progressive for an increasingly authoritarian South Korean government to let this guy take the remnants of this hair and put it on a gallery floor. It's not a gallery. This is actually an abandoned church. So again, one other thing to just think about is where these sort of exhibitions or where these artworks are displayed. It's not always displayed in the gallery or museum context, again, because that burden of surveillance is becoming increasingly more kind of overt, especially by 1968, especially after, say, the suspension of the Constitution, the declaration of martial law in 1972. So one might also think about, say, this work as a commemoration of all the bodies that are now invisible, that have now been absorbed into this larger sort of militarized politic. That it's no longer, we don't know who this hair really belongs to. They're just been kind of absorbed. So in some ways, how does this actually commemorate all the disappearance of those bodies? But Lee Seung-taek was also a member of a different kind of artist group. And the artist group actually has a lot of importance in Korea because people are they don't really buy into the government idea of, you have to belong to a university or you have to be affiliated with an institution because it's not so free, it's not so flexible. And Lee Seung-taek and his friend Ha Jung-hyun were part of another, a more informal group called the AG. The AG literally means avant-garde. So just in case there was any confusion about their intentions, there it is, AG. And as part of his contribution to the AG, so it's artists but also critics, is he makes this work called Work 74A. And what it is it's really kind of painting kind of turned on its head. So Ha Jung-hyun starts out making sort of these abstract expressionist type of abstractions, and then he kind of gets fed up with it and turns to, say, freestanding objects. So how is it that, say, rocks or paper can be put in connection to one another? Now, in 74, he goes back to painting. But what he does is he covers wooden slats with sort of that kind of coarse brown paper, and then he throws them down onto a pan that's has about maybe 2 inches of just white oil paint, just really kind of thick and viscous. And if you throw something down on, say, that kind of material with that force, what you get is say, paint just kind of oozing from the edges. So he would then push together the slats so that what you get was a painting that, yes, it was upright. It seemed like it was on a canvas, but it very much flaunted its three-dimensionality. So for Ha Jung-hyun, what he was interested in is producing what he very explicitly called objects, neither painting nor sculpture. I want people to think about the materials. So he starts to develop this idea of, again, trying to kind of not sort of rethink the division between the 2- and 3-dimensional by developing a technique where he would take a canvas, stretch it on sort of 4 legs. Actually, there are actually legs taken from a school desk. And then he would go underneath that canvas and push paint to the surface. So again, really overturns this idea of painting being an explicitly frontal proposition. So the kinds of works that he makes just shortly after that work that we just saw, you just see the sort of paint kind of oozing from the back to the front. Now, someone like Ha Jung-hyun, when he starts to think about why is it that he's kind of embarking on a new technique, is again going back to this larger theme of reconstruction that by, say, the late 60s and early 70s wasn't just full swing. And just to illustrate that point is these are some covers of Space or 공간, and between its initial publication 1966 and to about 1976, it was Korea's most important art journal. It was actually a journal of visual art design and architecture, but it was the only publicly distributed journal that also carried art criticism. So in terms of actually a resource for thinking about post-war Korean art, Space pretty much was almost like a diary of every exhibition was, especially if it was experimental in nature, was covered in this magazine. But Space had sort of a soft spot in its heart for architecture and images of building. Its founder, a man named Kim Soo-gun, he was an architect. He was almost sort of the de facto state architect of Korea. So the 1988 Olympic Stadium in Jamsil, that was designed by him, for example. But here what we have, just by way of context, on the left is a model for Yeouido. So Yeouido is that island that that bisects the Han River that runs through Seoul, and it was originally planned to be kind of an alternative downtown. But until recently, those plans didn't really quite pan out the way that the state wanted. Now, on the right is another cover of Space where you see all these sort of elevated highways and all these high-rise buildings. Now, that image of verticality, of sort of rising up from the ground, was a trope that you would just see repeated over and over again, not just on the cover of Space, which was partially funded by the government, but also in terms of the photographs that were selected by the National Art Salon, that were selected to grace the covers of government publications, this idea of verticality, of looking up, even though the buildings themselves were not actually very tall. Now, an example of, and this is something that, say, photographers who are really interested in thinking about the other face of society were very much interested in. So on the left, we have Chun Min-jo. So Chun Min-jo actually begins his career as a photojournalist, like so many others, as does his close colleague Chu Myung-duk. Now, on the left, what you see here, that big black building, is Korea's first curtain walls skyscraper. It's called, appropriately enough, Samil Building. So March 1st, Independence Day building. And it's not quite finished. You can kind of see that the sort of the last floors are sort of not quite there. And then you see this poor, tired guy kind of just smack in the middle of that foreground. So he's completely immobile. It really runs against the idea of a very sort of hypermobile, fluid, active city. He almost looks like he's dead, and he has this very sort of kind of low-tech cart right there. This is an image, just to give you a comparison. It's very different than the promotional images that the government would just kind of circulate, not only at home, but also through its embassies. The image that you see on the right is actually from a Korean embassy brochure that was brought to the United States. And so what you see here is that the completed building, it's against this nice blue sky, which unfortunately we don't have so much in Seoul anymore. All these cars and the elevated highways. And so you can already see that real sort of contrast, what it is that Chun Min-jo is trying to get at. Now, the photograph on the right, again, photograph on the right was actually made for a fine art context. So again, by the late 60s, photography is increasingly being admitted as something that was shown in galleries, may not necessarily be commercially viable, but it was still shown and contextualized not as photojournalism, but as almost as if it could be painting. And so what you see at the top are two branches of an elevated highway. So this was the other South Korean government claim to glory, is having these sort of big concrete elevated highways. But he's not taking a picture of the highways. His camera is pointed down on the people below. And you don't see crowds. You just see two individuals kind of going their separate way. Again, we talked a little bit about that issue of scale, about, say, on the one hand, you have sort of this relentless state-driven emphasis on the collective, on the myth of a nation, on the idea of one race. But here what you have is these, in both cases, the image of just single people. You know, what happens to these bodies amidst all of this rhetoric? Chu Myung-duk also goes on to photograph people that are in Korea but are distinctly marginalized. So this is part of a series called Chinatown. And what this is he went to Incheon, so not very far from Seoul, where the airport is today, and he took pictures of the Chinese still living in Korea. Now, the history of Chinese living in Korea is quite interesting because these are all descendants of 19th century Qing dynasty merchants who come to Korea when Korea's borders are forcibly opened up. And they live there, they set up their homes there. But what happens after, say, 1949? So 1949, so mainland China comes under the rule of Mao Zedong. They are deprived of, they have no citizenship. Taiwan doesn't want them either. And because of restructuring of property laws in Korea, they're deprived of their homes. So they have no legal right to, say, own a home in Korea. So they're essentially stateless citizens. So one thing that Chu Myung-duk was very interested in is this idea of how is it that we can make visible these sorts of the invisible margins. What's interesting a lot about these photographs, too, is the way they're cropped. Especially with photographs, he's not the distance at which one is looking at these images. We're not really in their houses, but we're not really, say, looking at them as specimens from far away either. There's a certain kind of ambiguity as to what is our place in relation to these images here. And just keep in mind that these would be seen by a Korean audience. So what is the relationship that an ordinary Korean citizen looking at this in a gallery might have to these individuals? Now, just to take a slight turn, because I know time is running a little short, is just to briefly go through some of the other works that really kind of deal with media like performance and bringing works to the outside. So here we have a work by Kim Gurim called From Phenomenon to Trace. And you see just straight away that it's outside on a riverbank, and you see this weird sort of triangular pattern on top, and those are not crop circles. That's him deliberately setting fire to certain parts of this of the grass as to create this shape. So in many ways, this is one of the first instances of what we might commonly recognize as land art in Korea. So how is it that land can be taken as the basis for thinking about an artwork? Another example of an artist, say, trying to bringing his works outside the gallery to engage more directly with the space outside is Hong Myung-suk. So here he has these ladders that are made of pretty much just common twine. And he drapes them on, say, these stones that are not actually in Seoul, but in the countryside. So one other thing, little wrinkle to keep in mind is that by the late 1970s, the pace of urban industrialization is such that the level of pollution is just unprecedented. And a lot of these artists are very much environmentally aware of what sort of costs does, say, industrialization have on this on this sort of the natural world. And so in many respects, a lot of these works that we're taking outside were also meant to serve as certain kinds of, say, memorials to a land that, for them, they thought it was pretty much eroding beneath their feet. Again, another example along this vein is Lee Gun-young. And it's a work that he did in 1973 that this actually is shown in a gallery, in the Museum of Modern Art in Korea. And what it is that it's a tree that he uprooted. So this was a tree that he had taken from the side of the road that was being raised to make way for one of the large highways going from Seoul to Busan. And he saw this kind of sad tree on the side of the road, and he just took it. So technically, it was an act of legal appropriation, because anything that the government raises that is by Korean law would be the government's property. But here what he's done is he paid off some of his neighbors and said, can you just take this tree for me into the museum? And he mounted this tree on a cube of dirt. So the cube was created with a wooden mold. And initially, museum officials refused to let this in because they thought he was hiding a bomb in the cube. Because also, one thinks about the fact that the Museum of Modern Art at this time was in spitting distance of the presidential palace, Cheongwade. So, and this is 1973, not long after North Korean commandos make an almost successful attempt to assassinate the president. So people are a little on edge. So they're thinking any weird object, any sort of large unknown object, it's got to be some kind of bad motive that has to be ascribed to it. But in many ways, that was sort of Lee Gun-young's point, is how is it that objects alone, that the mere combination of just a tree and some dirt would be enough to excite so much, say, suspicion. Now, the last work that I'm going to talk about in this vein is going back to Lee Seung-taek. And this work is called Artist's Cottage, which is kind of an odd work or odd title to call it, because it's really wood stacked on top of each other, and there's a blue triangle and a red triangle painted on it. And so it's meant to be a structure, but it's completely uninhabitable. It completely denies, say, any kind of practical function from the structure. In fact, a useless object. And this idea of being useless has a certain kind of resonance at this time in the late 70s, where you have the state telling you that you have to make yourself useful. You have, say, movements like the Semaul Undong. You have, say, just relentless kind of public programming that's designed to make you feel as if you have an obligation to serve your nation, to serve your fellow citizens. But here what he's doing is saying, you know what, yeah, I'm an artist, I'm going to make a completely useless object, and you're going to have to deal with that. So there's a certain kind of confrontational quality about a lot of the works that these artists are making. For example, someone like Lee Gun-young, who's taking on his head that kind of traditional idea of sculpture having a base, and then you have some kind of vertical column. And here he has a base, but it's made of dirt, and he has this kind of tree, and the tree is something that's not valued at all. It's just basically intended as garbage, something that got in the way of highway construction, but here it's again given a new life. Now, one sort of aspect I only briefly touched upon, which how much time do we have left, Daniel? No, so I try to. I would like to respect everyone's time here, but I did want to touch upon this performance work by Lee Gang-so, and it's called "Pub in a Gallery." And some of you who've studied contemporary art history might be familiar with this idea of relational aesthetics, which basically means doing an everyday activity in a white cube gallery. But Lee Gang-so is doing this, say, in 1974, so well before relational aesthetics gains that currency. So what he's done is he's taken this little gallery that's in the basement in Anguk-dong, so in the center of Seoul, and he set up a makgeolli bar inside the gallery. All of these tables and chairs are actually from his favorite makgeolli bar in Daegu. So he's from Daegu, and he actually says, you know what, I love these bars and these stools and chairs. And the proprietor of that bar said, you know, they're just made out of wooden boxes that were found outside the U.S. military base. And, you know, it's not fancy or anything. And he said, you know what, I'll take it. So he literally buys out the entire restaurant and he brings it back into this gallery, and he has all these little signs, that says, that's nakjibokum, samgyetang. I think that's, there's one for, there are different signs that you would see in sort of restaurants, but they're not fancy restaurants. These are sort of your working class, you know, kind of you grab a bite and then you go back to whatever backbreaking labor that the state or the state wants you to do. But here, what he's done is he just had ordinary people come in, and initially it was mostly just artists, but then you just had regular people just coming in off the street. And that was something that was quite unprecedented, to have a performance that really involved, say, just everyday people in this kind of setting. Just one thing to think about, though, is that there are no women. So, again, there's a certain kind of, I don't want to say machismo, but there's a certain kind of, again, there's a certain kind of, say, gender dimension to a lot of these performances that, again, hasn't perhaps been as talked about as vigorously as it should. Another performance that was undertaken a little bit earlier, from 1970, and it was by a group called the Fourth Group. And they weren't just artists. They included a fashion designer, they included a graphic designer, and even a Buddhist monk. So really, all walks of life. And you see in the photograph in the middle, they're carrying the Korean flag, and they look like they're in an official parade or procession. But they're actually carrying a coffin of books and other sorts of paraphernalia that they feel represent establishment culture. And they call their work Funeral of Establishment Art and Culture, and they're marching through the middle of downtown Seoul. Now, as the newspaper article notes, the police did not take kindly to this and had two of them arrested for violating the traffic law. That there were so many people that were coming to look at this performance that it actually disrupted the flow of traffic. So one theme that you see here is, how is it that performance is able to disrupt, say, these certain kinds of, say, social norms that maybe everyone else might have taken for granted at this time. Another artist who is thinking about the everyday as a medium through which to think about, well, how is it that information is being channeled, is a man named Song Neung-kyung. And Song Neung-kyung is, he does lots of things, performance, but this body of work is perhaps what he's best known for. And he takes newspapers and cuts out articles, all of the articles, and puts them in those vinyl sort of vitrines on the floor. So what you get in the end in this performance is just a newspaper with just blank, just white squares. Now, this kind of tactic is something that also resonates very closely with what Latin American artists are doing, especially in Argentina or Brazil, that also have very, very rigid censorship codes. So in cutting out, say, these articles, to what extent is Song Neung-kyung trying to say, you know what, the way that the information that's printed on the page, it might as well be blank. Yeah. Now, to go briefly back to painting. So this idea of thinking about, well, how is it that one can question this idea of artworks having to mean something, is someone like Park So-bol. So Palpable, whose work that we saw previously as part of, say, the younger generation of artists interested in abstract art, by 1973, he shifts gears and embarks on a series. So it's called écriture, so literally means writing. And it's just pencil marks that are a pencil that's applied to a not fully dried canvas of sort of white cream, sort of creamy white or sometimes creamy grayish paint, and just goes over it at sort of one stroke after the other. Now, writing, again, as the image of Sung Neung-kyung cutting out the newspapers might suggest, it's an activity that's very, very fraught in 1973. So 1 year after martial law is declared, and the government is not so good at scrutinizing visual material, but it is very, very close when it reads very closely when it comes to anything text related. So even, say, broaching this idea of the brushstroke imitating, say, writing. This is something that, again, it's not really sort of the safe thing to do at this time. But one also has to think about that Palpable was very much part of the state in some respects as well. So on the left and on the right, so these are both government-commissioned works. So the statue of Lee Sun-shin we saw earlier, so it was done by Kim Se-jung, whose son actually, incidentally, is a well-known contemporary artist, Kim Bum. As you see here, it's a complete group effort. Oftentimes these sculptors would, it's in the name of Kim Se-jung, but it's using your students as slave labor. So that's a time-honored Korean tradition. And I do none of that. And on the left was Palpable. He also participated in the Korean state's largest visual arts project called the National Documentary Paintings Project, 민족 기록화. And basically all of the prominent artists were told, okay, go out and glorify Korea. So initially it was scenes of historical battles and victories. And by 1974, though, the theme then moved on to economic development. So Palpable is tasked to basically paint this really sort of just unattractive large boat that's loaded with goods for export. And so he actually goes down to Busan, and he just is there to oversee this scene. But what's interesting about this particular work is that most of these really, for lack of a better word, propaganda paintings, is that you never see, say, individuals looking upon the scene. So one thing just to think about is, well, to what extent is the viewer meant to identify with those two guys kind of just hanging out by that railing and that net sort of in the lower left-hand corner? So you also think about the fact that this is a 6.5 foot high painting. And so when it was installed in the Museum of Modern Art, the proportions of these bodies are almost identical to your sort of regular adult viewer. Another thing that's interesting about, say, of this work is how he literally spells out entry and export. So the lettering that you see right under the lamp sort of in the middle. Now, I bring this up here, one, because, again, oftentimes when one thinks about propaganda, we tend to think about its creators as being sort of dupes or sort of complicit stooges with those who created these paintings. But actually, in many cases, when you think about or start reading the paintings closely, you realize that the artists are actually trying to get you to focus on something other than what it is that the government wants you to see. So what's noticeable is not really necessarily the ship so much, but again, those words and those weird sort of guys in the lower left that almost look like ghosts or shadows. So again, just to kind of go back to the same kind of the works that Palpable was making almost simultaneously. So again, this idea of embarking on a certain kind of abstraction, but one that really kind of started to toy with this idea of art having to mean something. So meaning was something that was incessantly emphasized. But someone like Palpable is very much aware of the fact that you can't necessarily spell everything out. That's not what an artwork is supposed to do. So we just have an image of Palpable in his studio. So again, he takes, initially he had an easel, but with larger works, he kind of had them on the floor, and he would just repeat the same mark over and over again. Now, just as sort of a corollary to Paxabo's mark making is a work called Body Drawing by a performance artist named Lee Gon-young. Now, Lee Gon-young is part of that group called the Avant-garde that we talked about earlier. He's also an artist who really doesn't has no patience for these divisions of media. But what he's also interested in, again, is to reemphasize the scale of the individual human body. So what this work consists of is, so this is actually a reenactment. So what he does is he takes a big piece of cardboard, he measures himself, and the point at which his head kind of hits the line, he then cuts off. He goes behind the board, and then he takes either a brush or a marker, and he just kind of reaches over to the, and so the length of the line is the fullest extent that his arm can reach over. And he repeats this process until the end result is the work that, again, stacks up to his that correlates to his own height. So in one sense, this work concerns this idea of trace. What is it that's left behind? How is it that I can leave a trace of myself? And two, how is it that this work can actually, again, reemphasize this idea of human proportions that weren't really in the equation in society at large? Another artist along this similar vein is Kang Guk-jin, another friend of Lee Gon-young. And we talked a little bit about artists interested in freestanding objects, and he was probably one of the most diligent in this respect. So here what you have is you have like a small wooden cube, and he's wrapped rope around it and fabric. So one of the things that he's very much interested in is, say, the encounter of materials. So how to say that an artist is not someone that creates or makes something, but an artist is someone who facilitates the relationship between sort of regular, ordinary objects. This is something that he gets from Liu Fan, probably arguably one of Korea's best-known post-war artists. And in both cases, what you see here is you see him sort of bringing in sort of objects, unmediated objects, so a stone, together on a canvas, or stones pulling apart, say, a rubber sheet. So how is it that one can think about an artist other than this sort of framework of authorship? Now, Liu Fan plays a very instrumental role in promoting Korean art overseas. So you notice on the right that it was shown at the 7th Paris Biennial in 1971. This is the biennial that he actually curated the Korean contribution. So he selected the artists including Lee Gon-young, who participate in that biennial. He was the one who facilitated a lot of Korean artists to show in Japan. The series for which, one of the series for which he's best known is From Point. And again, when we talk about, say, these kinds of paintings, there really is sort of that lingering engagement with the materials of different kind of genre. So you already notice at the bottom, it's mineral pigment on canvas. This is mineral pigment that's used in Nihonga. So that's a genre of painting that we talked about earlier with the wonderful Korean Virgin Mother and Jesus. That's very kind of this very sort of dense, almost rocky, chalk-like pigment. It's very hard to move. So what he did is to combine that with glue, and he would take his brush, and it's a brush that you would use in calligraphy or ink painting, and just repeatedly press against the canvas until the brush ran out of paint. And he would just do this in sort of successive rows. What's interesting about that effect too, though, it's again, you start to also think about, say, an image pixelating. So again, this is made in the early 1970s. He's living in Japan when he's painting these works. And so the idea of, say, moving from an analog to a digital mindset is something that also oddly kind of resonates with sort of this idea of appearance and disappearance that you see throughout his series From Point and also his corresponding series From Line. Just as sort of another complement is, again, Kwon Young-woo's work. So someone who's an ink painter. By the late 1970s, ink painting is no longer considered contemporary. It's almost completely excluded from exhibitions of contemporary art designed to showcase contemporary Korean art overseas. But Kwon Young-woo is one of the few exceptions to that. And partially, again, it's because of the fact he doesn't use ink. He doesn't use sort of an obvious signifier to say, hey, I'm an ink painter. he starts a different series by 1980, where what he does is he actually wets certain parts of the paper in sort of these circular formations, and then he just pierces it from behind. So what you get is what he called eggshell carton works. So they kind of look like broken sort of eggs or eggshells. So again, really trying to emphasize that idea of, say, painting as being necessarily three-dimensional. Now, there's only a few more slides left, but again, going back to, so what we start to have here in terms of, the reason why I'm sort of flip-flopping between different sorts of media is by the late 70s, you start to get a much more fluid, much more looser sense of the world than we had seen, say, in the late 40s or the early 50s. And this is actually a reenactment, but this is a performance called Relay Life that Lee Gun-young did in 1979, and he did it in Daegu. Now, Daegu is, as many of you know, is quite a ways from Seoul. The reason for that is it's a place that isn't as subject to outright government scrutiny as Seoul is. So in some ways, there's a certain measure of freedom. So 1979, between 1974 and 1979, there was a festival called the Daegu Contemporary Arts Festival. This was the premier venue if you wanted to do performance, video-based artworks that, again, didn't necessarily fall into the prescribed categories of medium. And so what you have here with Lee Gun-young is, so he starts out the performance fully clothed, and he's actually wearing a button-down white shirt and shoes and socks, sort of like a typical office worker, which is madness because he did this performance originally in August. August in Daegu is really unpleasant on many levels. So he's wearing this, again, this deliberately sort of out-of-place outfit, and he progressively takes off each article of clothing. So on the far right, what you see is his shoes, and he takes off his socks, then he takes off his trousers, then he takes off his underwear and his shirt, and then he takes off his underclothing, even takes out his wallet and the coins inside his wallet. So what you get at the end is him just prostrate, lying down, just naked. He also likes to say, and when this was reenacted, that there were women spying on him eagerly. So we all have a little bit of wire in us. But again, one thing just to, it's not the nudity that really is of note here, but it's, again, really this idea of just kind of stripping oneself of all sort of these artifice or sort of the daily armor you have to function in life. What does it mean to just kind of be prostrate, just to lie flat on the ground? Another artist who showed during the Daegu Contemporary Arts Festival was Park Hyung-gi. Park Hyung-gi was, as you might notice, is a great admirer of Baek Nam-jun, but he takes the Baek Nam-jun video concept in a different direction. He's someone who's also very much interested in Liu Fan's work. So this idea of bringing in incongruent materials to produce something that didn't exist before. So what he's done here is, a lot of times he uses stone, and he uses stones that he just find kind of on the local riverbanks. He piles them up, and then he often puts the TV sort of either on top or sort of on the bottom. Again, how is it that, say, rocks that have existed for, I don't know, centuries or decades, something that's has a certain kind of relationship to the ruin, be juxtaposed with a TV, something that in 1978 was considered uncommon. It was had lots of associations with being recent, being new. How does, say, these two ideas of temporality come together? How can they kind of form a tension of their own? And the last work that I'm going to show today is of Jeon Min-jo. So Jeon Min-jo is someone that we saw with poor tired guys at the foot of the Samil building. In 1977, he produces a photograph called Apgujong. Now, this is where this guy is tilling the soil right here. This is where the Uniqlo store is, for those of you who are familiar with Apgujong. And we think of Gangnam. So all of you know, unfortunately or fortunately, that the Gangnam song, which again is played everywhere, especially in Michigan. I don't even want to get started on that. But we think of Gangnam as being very modern, as being sort of contemporary. But in 1977, most of it was still just farmland. And so one of the things, again, to think about that idea of fragmentation is Chun Min-jo is very much interested in that division. How is it that one can convey this? How can one make this very visceral? And so what you have here is, so that's the Hyundai apartments at on the top. And then suddenly you just drop into this guy tilling his field with a giant ox. A giant ox. I mean, you couldn't get more sort of, say, separated from that. Lots of people think this was photoshopped. No, that I can assure you that did not happen. It's just not something that would have happened with, say, the technology that was available to them at that time. So I would like to end here because, again, this is an image that really kind of gets at this idea of, say, an art world that it didn't really quite cohere, but it didn't quite cohere in ways that were interesting enough to think about a different way of sensing, well, what exactly does contemporary Korean art mean, given all these different streams of thinking? So thank you very much for your time. I know I went over time, but if you have questions, please let me know.